Okay, welcome everyone. We're just going to get started in a minute. Thank you all for joining us. Jamila, if you could turn on your camera, that would be great. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a timely and exciting conversation. I don't know if anyone can get that excited about federalism and the future of rights in the United States, but I think if anyone can get us excited, it is a group like this. I'm pleased to be joined today by esteemed colleagues from throughout the country. Give it another minute to get started. Maybe I'll go back to the music. Should I go back to the music, folks? Or are we good? No? Okay. No more of that repeat music. Okay, I can't find my the bios that have been written just in the text setup that I have, so let's just get started. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a week after Election Day, and while the results of the presidential election are clear, at least for most of us, there's still some uncertainty in terms of what the future will be in terms of the balance of power in the Senate. But we're so accustomed to thinking and paying attention, especially during presidential election years, to national politics, that often many of us lose sight of the fact that states are important players, have been since the founding of the Republic, and their role has changed over the years. Pleased to be joined today with esteemed colleagues from throughout the country to reflect on the recent past, as well as think ahead to the future of progressive federalism in a polarized United States, in a polarized America. Polarization, either if you think about it at the national level politically in terms of parties, but especially in a federalism framework. Joined today by my dear friend and colleague, Janelle Wong from the University of Maryland, who will be moderating the session, and followed by Allan Colbern, who's a co-author of mine in a book that we just published called Citizenship Reimagined. I have my copy here too, Allan. So it's thicker and heavier than I imagined. So Allan will say a few words about the book, and then we'll go to Elizabeth Cohen, who blurbed the book and has just been a very helpful thought partner and a leader in this space of thinking about citizenship and expanding our notions of citizenship. Elizabeth, so first, Allan is a professor at Arizona State University. Elizabeth Cohen is a professor at Syracuse University and has written extensively on citizenship. Then we'll go to Jamila Michener, who's a professor at Cornell University and has written most recently on federalism, and especially in the context of health policy. And then we'll end with Joel Rogers, who's a professor at University of Wisconsin and the founder and director of COWS. We're going to have this as a fairly interactive session. We'll be monitoring comments as they come in through our streams on Facebook and YouTube as well. So first, let me turn it over to Janelle Wong. Janelle, welcome, and thank you for helping us moderate the session.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much, and congratulations to Allan and Karthick for your new book. Allan, let's open it up. Let's open with your work. You and Karthick Ramakrishnan just published a book called Citizenship Reimagined, and you argue that states and state power can be vehicles for the expansion of rights, including for non-citizens. This flies in the face of how many of us were taught to understand state versus federal power when it comes to the expansion of rights. So can you lay out your argument for us?
Yeah, thanks so much for kind of hosting this event. It's great to be amongst all of you guys who I admire your work. So to kind of give a brief overview of the argument that we make in the book, we argue that essentially federalism is essential to progress on citizenship rights. So rather than thinking about federalism as naturally bad for civil rights, we kind of look at citizenship rights and how they develop and emerge and the role that federalism plays. And we argue a few different things. We argue that states can innovate new rights that inform the future of national rights. So if we're looking kind of back to history in the antebellum era, we see that free Blacks in the North were granted voting rights prior to the 15th Amendment after the Civil War. We also saw non-citizens or immigrants who were given the national, state, and local voting rights prior to World War II. And this was done at the state level. Women's suffrage also kind of grew at the state level first before it became a push for the amendment. Gay marriage kind of originated at the state level in terms of rights. And immigrant rights more broadly today, we're seeing expanding in states like California and New York in very diverse ways. And states can also, we argue, expand rights beyond what is provided at the federal level. And we think that this is crucial in what we call progressive state citizenship, where states build on top of federal rights that are existing. So if we're looking at the federal level as providing a baseline of rights, we argue that in fact states and local governments as well can build on top of those. So we've seen federal rights as a baseline rather than a ceiling on what state and local governments can do and should do. And so the book, generally, we offer a new framework for imagining and kind of thinking about citizenship. We argue that it's a bundle of rights that we call 5 kind of core dimensions: the right to free movement, the right to due process and legal protection, the right to develop human capital, the right to participate and be represented, and the right to identify and belong. And we apply this conceptual framework at the national, state, and local level. So we say that these rights are provided by all 3 levels. And in fact, this provides the kind of federated citizenship that we start to unpack. And we say that 3 different types of citizenship has emerged along these rights at the state level. So we've had historically progressive state citizenship, where states have built and expanded beyond what the federal level is providing in terms of rights to Blacks, to immigrants, to women, to LGBT, and so forth. And we also highlight, of course, the areas of more contention where states are regressing. So regressive state citizenship, where states are actively denying their residents, their citizens, the rights that are supposed to be protected at the federal level. And what we argue is that these types of citizenships are at the state level, they emerge in a federated context where the Constitution, courts, Congress, and the willingness and the capacity of the executive to actually enforce federal rights shapes and structures how state citizenship actually emerge. And so we have Jim Crow laws emerging. That's a symptom of the federal government not enforcing federal rights, or the courts reinterpreting constitutional rights. And so this allows states to go below that baseline of federal rights. And what we're advocating for, and what we explain in detail, is how do you actually expand rights at the state level, so progressive state citizenship. And we argue that social movements and state officials are key actors in kind of working together to push progressive policies.
Thank you so much, Allan. And Allan, you and Karthick talk a lot about state citizenship and the role of state governments and other actors in expanding rights at the state level. I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Elizabeth Cohen from Syracuse University, who has written extensively over my lifetime about citizenship. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Dr. Cohen, what can you add to this discussion related to citizenship?
Thanks so much, Janelle. I want to congratulate Allan and Karthick on this huge accomplishment. And I think in order for people to understand the scope of this accomplishment and what this book offers us, it'd be really helpful to take a step back and think a little bit about what citizenship means to us, where the concept comes from, and kind of what our expectations are. And you know, one of the interesting things about citizenship, it's a very contested term. there's lots of different ways in which it gets used in political science and in our kind of daily conversations. But at the core of the idea of citizenship and the institutions associated with it is this expectation of equality, right? So even if you go back and look at classical models and definitions of citizenship, there's this sense in which creating citizenship is creating an opportunity for everybody who is a citizen to have some kind of equal political status. And it is a means for ancient democracies to get rid of certain forms of aristocracy and oligarchy that are seen as easily corrupted. And, it's a narrow group of people who qualify for citizenship. It comes with a bundle of rights and responsibilities. And all along, you can kind of see that there's something a bit of a myth in a way involved in this, in the sense that there's not a really super neat divide between who is a citizen and who's not a citizen. There's a little fraying at the edges. But this gets really intensely complicated when you translate the idea into a more contemporary context in which we import ideas of liberalism, which tell us not just that citizenship has to give people forms of equality, but that it has to be pretty capacious, expansive, inclusive. And we're constantly kind of pushing the boundaries of inclusion at certain points in the development of ideas of liberalism and the implementation of liberal concepts in the writing of constitutions. And all this differentiation comes along with that, right? So the fraying at the edges that I discussed early on, turns into full-blown different forms of, in my own work, I've called it semi-citizenship, kind of partial statuses, in which there really isn't just citizen and non-citizen. There's all of these different types of citizenship. And what makes this book such a big accomplishment is not just that you're starting to look at one of the really important kind of conduits or creators of different forms of citizenship, but you are pushing up against the narrative that underlies this, which is that we have to all have the same kind of citizenship in order to push towards more egalitarianism, that all these statuses have to look the same in order for people to have equality. In fact, they don't. And you show lots and lots of ways in which we can do things for people that actually expand that bundle of rights that they get as citizens without necessarily it being uniform, the same bundle of rights for everyone, everywhere. So I hope we can kind of get into the weeds a little bit, but that gives, I think, listeners a sense of why this is such a big deal.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And Karthick, did you want to chime in on some of these thoughts?
No, I just want to add that it's been it's been great to be in conversation with scholars like Elizabeth, whose work on semi-citizenship we engage with in a pretty significant way. And I mean, it's the kind of thing, and Elizabeth later, maybe, as we have a bit more of a kind of free form kind of conversation, because I don't think we've had a kind of back and forth conversation on this. Just that, to think about if it's possible to have full citizenship, at a state level and a local level, right? So it's a kind of intersection of, you can think about things as one way people might think of state citizenship as a partial form of citizenship, but in fact, we argue that, actually, I guess I should put myself in the, I'll put myself in the main screen here. But we argue that, whether something is partial or full can be looked at each level, right? At the national level, at the state level, at the local level. So I don't think I've fully gotten your kind of thoughts, because in some ways, I don't think we push back at all in what you said, because we still allow for semi-citizenship, even at the state level, but just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, what I mean to suggest you're pushing back on is more the sense that equality implies sameness. and I think like that's our default. Lots of us who have thought about this, that like if people don't have the same exact bundles of rights, that somebody is therefore experiencing a probably damaging form of inequality. And it's certainly like there's lots and lots of instances we can point to in which that's the case. But I think that that you highlight some ways in which not only can states be progressively push at a subnational level for rights that everybody absolutely should have and need, but also for things that may be distinct to certain categories of people or to people experiencing certain types of circumstances.
This is actually a great segue into some of our other panelists' work. So we're all thinking about the results of this election, and this will wrap back to, I think, some of the themes that you brought up, Elizabeth and Karthick. But let's talk about the power shifts that have just occurred or will are assumed to occur. How would having a Democrat in the White House change views about the role of states in protecting or furthering rights for marginalized groups when it comes to addressing poverty, voting rights, racism, especially in those red states that are now regrouping? Let's go to Professor Jamila Michener from Cornell University. Jamila.
Hi, thank you everyone for listening today. And maybe I'm a nerd for feeling like this is a really exciting conversation. And for being grateful for some of the concepts that we get from Allan and Karthick's new book, and that we get from Elizabeth's work, that allow us to grapple with how to make sense of citizenship and federalism under the same umbrella, right? And I think that what's happening now politically in our actual country gives us an opportunity to see how these are not just sort of dusty academic ideas, but they're ideas that are at play in our world, on the ground in people's lives. And I always sort of jokingly say, like, you never really know how you feel about federalism and states' rights until there's someone who you don't like in the White House, right? And so I think, I started off, the very early part of the process of writing my first book, which focuses on federalism and Medicaid. President Obama was in the White House, and, his sort of potential criticisms of Obama notwithstanding, when it came to healthcare, he felt like a safe person to have in the White House, and the sort of person under whom you might want a more consolidated power at the center, on the national level. And then, of course, before I finish with the book, President Trump is ushered into the White House, and suddenly, what started off as a book that was quite critical of federalism, I had to rethink, right? And luckily, there was lots of room for me to rethink that because of the work of Joel and a number of other people who had already been long thinking kind of critically about federalism. And so I think, I'm of two minds when it comes to a Democrat being in the White House, depending on what you care about. And for the things I care about, like racial inequality, economic inequality, and access to social rights like health and housing, et cetera. My preference is to have a Democrat in the White House rather than not. And I think that bodes well for some possibilities on the federal level. But I also think that that a Biden administration is going to be constrained in a number of different ways. Of course, it depends on how the Senate breaks, which we won't know for quite a while. But almost irrespective of that, the kind of deep partisan polarization in our country means that no matter who is in the White House, that administration faces a variety of significant constraints and will have to make significant compromise, right? Even if there are opportunities to move forward, there's lots of compromise that will constantly have to be made to even sustain some forward movement in a variety of policy arenas, and healthcare is a great example. The ACA, even at a time when Democrats were in control, reflected a range of really significant compromises, right? There was no public option. There were a number of other things that Democrats would have wanted to see but couldn't couldn't implement given the political circumstances. And I think that opens a door for just understanding the limits of what the federal government can do. And even when it's doing good, in many ways, it's best with respect to setting a floor and not necessarily a ceiling, especially in the present context. And so this is where states can be really valuable in kind of pushing things forward and doing more and being sort of more progressive and more avant-garde. And of course, those processes feed into one another. The other thing I'd say, and I guess I'll end with this because I don't want to go on for too long, I want us to be able to really have a conversation here, is just that irrespective of who ends up in the White House, so to those of us who are reasonable, it's looking like it's going to be Biden. The necessity for sort of not sitting on your laurels because, hey, we have a Democrat in the White House now, can't be understated. The next election will be here quickly, whether it's the midterm election or the presidential election, in the blink of an eye. And it's what happens often in the states and in localities on the ground with respect to politics and power that determines both what kind of floors are set at the federal level and who ends up occupying that space at the federal level, and determines what sort of bottom we might hit when we can no longer rely on the federal government to protect the most vulnerable among us.
Thank you so much, Professor Michener. I also just wanted to turn to Professor Joel Rogers from the University of Wisconsin, who has written extensively on progressive federalism in terms of policy implementation. So, Professor Rogers, what are your thoughts on what needs to happen next, given what Professor Michener just speculated upon? Professor Rogers, just need to unmute there.
I'm so sorry. I don't think, for reasons that Janelle just suggested, you're going to see anytime soon an enactment of the program that Biden, representing the Democratic Party, ran on. You're certainly not going to see anything like significant nationwide wage increases or the expansion of labor rights that were suggested in the PRO Act. You're not going to see a Green New Deal of anything like the dimensions that either AOC or Markey or people like that in the Congress or even Biden imagines. And you're not going to see a full extension of universal health care and universal pre-K and universal cheap access to education, or you may not even see the broadband stuff. So you're pretty constrained, I think. It's possible there'll be a Peachtree miracle on July 5th, and you'll see some of those things much more quickly than it's reasonable now to hope. But I think what you will see is what you've seen even during the Trump years, an incredible story that has not really been told and is not really fully grokked, I think, by Democrats even, much less Republicans in the Congress, this is a very big story, and it's a positive story in America, that communities around the country, cities, towns, villages, townships, a lot of people are doing a lot of the things that we'd like to see get done to improve people's lives quite materially and move the country forward. So what needs to happen, not what's going to happen, but what needs to happen, and I think this could actually happen, is move a fair amount of money out all over the country, not just to the megalopolises or the much talked about cities, but to a whole range of places, like 1,000 different places in the country, and give them easy money, maybe a little financial support, maybe a little regulatory relief, and a lot of friendly technical assistance in doing whatever they want to do above those floors that were described. As I understand progressive federalism, it's floors, not ceilings, on local and or state innovation. But I like to think of it now as at least requiring as much cooperation from those superordinate levels of government as a relief on the preemption pandemic that's going on all over America and really constraining the democratic will. So I think of it more as like a democratic federalism, both moving the country forward by making sure those floors are secure, but then in every possible way, regulatory relief, financial assistance, technical assistance, vast, wide, very accessible communities of practice and publicity on what's working and what's not, evaluation of those things, yada, yada, yada. A lot of help. So that's the cooperative part in making stuff happen. So that's what I think needs to happen.
Thank you so much. So for those of you who are tuned in via Facebook Live or via YouTube, please feel free to ask your questions through those platforms and we'll see your questions here. For now, I'd like to go back to Dr. Cohen and ask, having listened to the discussion so far, does this bring up any particular issues related to your own work or any thoughts related to the topics for you?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think I'm breaking a rule here, but I noticed in the chat somebody's brought up the census as a critical issue, and I fully agree. In fact, I was doing research in the way that every good scholar does on Twitter the other day, just trying to find out what the avenues are for trying to correct the damage that's been done to counting populations, the population in the states, given the fact that it was truncated under Trump. But that is directly connected to another issue that I think is really important, and that is constitutes a significant portion of the book, and that's immigration issues. And so one of the ongoing problems with census is trying to count the non-citizen population. And one of the ways in which Karthick and Allan talk about or kind of illustrate how state citizenship can be progressive is by talking about how states have been able to enhance the rights of people who are not U.S. citizens but are living and working in the country. And we hope coming out of a period of really transformative immigration restriction, both, we think about the harsh crackdowns on asylum seekers and undocumented immigrants that's been happening actually for quite a long time. But under the Trump, we saw really closing a lot of the avenues for legal immigration. Remains to be seen how quickly that can be undone and how committed a Biden administration would be to that. But in the meantime, as this book shows us, there's been incredible pushback in several key states in terms of building up the bundle of citizenship rights that's available to people who aren't territorial citizens, so to speak. And I think this really challenges us to think about the possibility that states, out of necessity and out of a sense of what's right and wrong, may develop forms of citizenship that are pretty robust for people who don't have U.S. passports, who aren't U.S. citizens, in a sense of having free movement and residency rights. And that would be just tremendously transformative to the idea of citizenship. Probably the biggest transformation in the contemporary era, I think.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. We're getting a number of really great questions, and so I wanted to share some of those. And the first is for you, Professor Rogers, which is, do you see this disbursement of resources happening at the municipal or hyper-local level, or at the county level, or direct to grassroots groups?
I would think that if it's federally led, you're probably going to want to do it through some sort of unit of government. I would hope it would go down to the municipal level, which of course includes counties, more than the states, because I think that's where the real communities of people coming together and figuring out what they'd like to do to improve their area are about. But I could see it very easily, and indeed I'd recommend that it include a requirement of very high levels of citizen participation in the decisions that are made about new projects that people want to do. Yeah, so I mean, and certainly this is just a very vague and obviously very wet idea, but I sort of very much miss the end of earmarks, because in earmarks, at least that gave people within a congressional district something to come together around that the district could do for their particular area. And I think we would be greatly advantaged if there was just a little bit of money, some pre-development money, some technical assistance, a variety of other things. Oh, and I should say the money is probably vital and important, but at least as important is the technical assistance. When I used to travel around, you'd run into endless numbers of people who were trying to reinvent one wheel or another that had already been tried elsewhere. I think that goes on a lot. And or people who had some need or some desire to do something which they thought was an insolvable problem. They'd often bring us in to give them advice. And we'd say, look, that's already been solved in X, Y, and Z municipality. Let's just connect you two to each other. The amount of isolation of these civic innovators that all you guys want to promote is pretty incredible to me. But that's a very easy thing for the federal government to, if it was on our side and actually wanted to improve the country rather than further destroy it, could easily do. So I don't know how exactly it would be done. You can imagine it being done through, the Office of Public Engagement, Intergovernmental Relations. It could maybe be done through, something. And that's probably the way. Let's leave Congress out for a second. That's probably the way the White House could lead on it. And in Congress, it could be done through any number of things. But OMB has a lot of unused guidances and orders that could be brought into play here. I think there's a clear legal basis for doing this. And the question is simply whether enough people are willing to cross the aisle somewhere in the Senate as presently constituted to begin to, give some reality to the claim that they're for decentralized government and power back to the people and home rule and all these other things that used to be part of the classic Republican refrain against the affirmative state. I think you can use that again, maybe to get some political support for this. But yes, I would. Yeah, I'm sorry to go on. Sorry.
No. I thank you for
stop me from talking.
Thank you for that response, and this is related. So we'll keep the conversation going in this direction, but. Given the state of play with the Senate and thinking through the future, Professor Michener, are there actions? So you mentioned the floor and the kind of role that the federal government might play in creating that floor. How do you see the Biden administration? That's kind of flipping things. How do you see the Biden administration taking up action through either executive orders or other kinds of administrative rules to maybe raise the floor for the various safety net programs that you have talked about in the past, written about?
I think if we look at the Trump administration over the last several years, that administration has been pretty creative about finding ways of using the power of executive and administrative power to get things, to try to accomplish things that otherwise legislatively couldn't be accomplished. And so there's no reason for the Biden administration not to be equally as creative. And actually, arguably, the Biden administration doesn't have to even be as creative, because a lot of the initial work is just in undoing so much damage that's been done, and perhaps using the damage itself as a sort of springboard for thinking about new ways to do good, right? So I'll use an example from Medicaid. Biden almost immediately out the gate, I think, will unwind some of what the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services has done under the Trump administration. So, essentially shelving things like reporting requirements, punitive elements of Medicaid policy, like, restricting eligibility windows and other kinds of changes to Medicaid that has happened through Section 1115 waivers that CMS has not only allowed to happen, but has encouraged, right? That really early on during the Trump administration, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services was saying to states like, hey, get creative because we're going to give you leeway to do these punitive things for the purposes of retrenchment that you weren't able to do before. And I think, a Biden administration should not only be thinking about like clawing back all of those punitive policies, but thinking about how to get creative in sort of opening up new spaces for states to do more things, right? So saying to states like, you can use Medicaid resources for the purposes of helping people to remain housed because housing is health. And we started to get glimpses of that under an Obama administration. And the Biden administration can open up opportunities like that. Those opportunities aren't necessarily going to represent federal floors because not all states will take up those opportunities, right? But they are at least going to. I think you can establish floors by saying what you cannot. The Biden administration can say, here's what you can't do. You can't do work reporting requirements. You can't do restrictive eligibility requirements. But then the ceilings piece comes in when they say, here's what you can do, a lot more than you've been doing thus far, and we'll allow that to happen, right?
Right.
That's just one example in one policy realm. And we can sort of think of in a similar structure throughout multiple policy realms, creating floors that limit states from doing harmful things and ceilings by deregulating, giving states power to do more beneficial things.
Thank you so much for those insights. Let's circle back to the census and the role that the census plays in these struggles over rights. Karthick, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you, Janelle. Yeah, I was kind of jumping at the bit when I saw census for a few reasons. I'll just say personally, right? I mean, in addition to being a professor and a center director here, we were very heavily involved in census with community partners. And one of the roles I had was as the unpaid director of the Inland Empire Census Complete Count Committee. We're a pretty big region, 4.6 million residents, 27,000 square miles. Enormous, about the size of the state of South Carolina in population and geography. It's important for federalism for a few reasons, and some of them are optimistic, some of them are actually quite concerning. So we know November 30th, the Supreme Court is going to take up a case to consider whether the Trump administration can get away with its recommendation of not including, basically excluding non-citizens from congressional apportionment. That would be pretty crazy if they actually allowed that, because the Constitution is very clear, and especially after the Reconstruction Amendments, after the Civil War, in terms of every person counting when it comes to congressional reapportionment. Beyond that, though, there's another extreme concern, and this is there was a Supreme Court case from Texas that was essentially set aside because of lack of data on non-citizens at a hyperlocal level. This is going to come back. The Trump administration is intending to produce the data on citizens and non-citizens at a census block level to hand it over to states so that they can draw maps of not one person, one vote, but one citizen, one vote. This is probably not going to happen in a state like California, but you can almost be certain that states like Alabama, Texas, and others are going to be drawing maps for state legislative districts, potentially even congressional districts that exclude non-citizens. And what that'll mean is that those living in areas with significant farm worker populations, in cities like Houston and other areas, they will lose representation to areas that have higher proportions of citizens. So this would be what we would consider either a reinforcing restrictive, and Allan, I need to think through this with you, or regressive, depending on the way that it's constructed. On the positive side, our center has now created a new project called Census Legacies. And what that does is actually go from the grassroots up. What we saw with census outreach is that you had various communities, including communities of color, immigrant communities, those serving LGBT populations, disabled populations, veterans, homeless, etc. All of those groups came together with this notion that everyone counts. So what we are trying to do is to then say, can we just go beyond the census here and making sure that not only that everyone counts for the purpose of census, but that everyone counts from that notion of political voice, right? And to build this stronger sense of what rights looks like and what political membership looks like, and to think of these census coalitions. I mean, I think that it's unfortunate. Census has now gotten politicized, and there's going to be a lot of lawsuits connected with it. And there's some people that are going to push a very exclusionary vision in terms of who counts when it comes to decision making. But we're optimistic in our region, and we're seeing support throughout the country in different localities, like in Houston Metro, like in the state of Florida, like in the state of New York, of building this more inclusive notion of membership.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to see so many of the concepts you all are studying play out through the census and litigation over the census. So this question is really for Allan, and it's from an audience member. Yeah, you put a lot of faith in state and local governments. How do you get around the status quo that is so prevalent at the county and city level in terms of elected officials when diverse leadership has not yet reached elected office?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question. And I think even places federalism more at the center as you kind of go down the levels of government in terms of how movement building can reach and kind of build up from the bottom up and build connections to local and then to state governments. And how that happened in California in the 1990s was in reaction to the anti-immigrant kind of leadership of California's state government, its policies. And so that building takes time. It takes, a lot of effort across the different regions of California and elsewhere. But building a more representative kind of movement as well also starts at the bottom. So California's movement around immigrant rights is going to look a bit different in terms of the different regions, also different from other states in terms of movement building and building alliances with elected officials and even electing your own officials. So that's definitely a story, I think, from our book's perspective, and it kind of starts from the bottom up, and it's definitely a story of the power of federalism as opposed to kind of looking top down and nationally, where these groups might be excluded from the conversation.
Hey, Janelle, would it be possible to push back against that question a little bit?
Okay.
Because I mean, I see there are a lot of cities and counties in the U.S. You're talking in the tens of thousands in the case of cities. And I see a huge number of much more diverse, obviously younger, but much, much younger than typical new leaders coming on all over the place. And the Mayor's Innovation Project, COWS runs, well, you should just go there and look at the cast of characters. It's substantially less male, pale, and stale than it was even a few years ago. And the problem they find, especially the women of color, especially, I might add, the Black women who are elected to these mayoral things, is a huge amount of pushback from exactly the sorts of structures the reader was asking about. The police chief that doesn't want to take orders from them, or the county exec who's stuck in their ways and will not cooperate with them on public works or whatever. But especially, it's not a problem of the municipal leadership. I think it's a problem of the capture of state houses and a lot of the governors mentioned, but especially the state legislatures, by these preemption police. I mean, they are just making it very difficult for cities to tax the way they want to tax, to regulate the way they want to regulate. I mean, look at it during the COVID thing, all these states preempting the ability of mayors to order public safety things on wearing masks or other things. The preemption is the big thing I think you need to worry about much more than we've talked about thus far.
So one thing, if I could jump on this, Janelle, just quickly on this. I think that it varies by state and jurisdiction. So I'll say here in the Inland Empire, where we are, there's such a disconnect, right? If you look at the congressional level and the state assembly and Senate level, it's moderate to progressive, depending on how you view it, right? And it's mostly blue. I mean, it used to be, we're a region that was red that turned purple, and that is now mostly blue at that level. Local elections are nonpartisan elections, so most voters have no idea, in terms of the ideology of local elected officials, and so there's a huge disconnect. What you saw in 2018, which was interesting, is you saw the power of the Latino vote in California. What we saw regionally was patterns where you had regions that voted for Democratic leadership, but then voted for Latinos who had no party affiliation, but actually were Republican. And so I think at the local level, at least what we see on the ground here, but this might vary by state and also the size of the municipality, is that some of these areas do indeed have a lot of older leadership, and because you don't have party labels or significant social movement kind of power building activity that has taken root, it's still several years away. And then these end up becoming sites of resistance. So the resistance we see in California is actually at the county level, resisting state orders to try to prioritize public health. Might look quite different in Wisconsin, or say Austin, Texas, vis-a-vis the state of Texas.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's a really great question that came in through the chat, which is, should we expect that variation in policy design across states leads people to conceptualize citizenship in terms of the rights attached and the role of government differently? I know there's quite a few people on this panel who can answer that question, and I'd love to go first to Professor Michener.
Yeah, so I mean, my immediate answer to this question is yes, we should expect that, right? We should absolutely expect that. And, part of what I show in my work is that to some extent, people don't have perfect information. Their information is limited, but people are also aware of policy context and of their political environments. And they understand that what resources they have access to and what, especially social rights they have as members of the polity are delimited based on where they live geographically, certainly across states. But even people understand that there are differences across counties, that there are differences across neighborhoods. And in my book, I try to think about federalism across those levels and not just as something that's happening between states and the national government. And what led me to think about that, because for a long time I thought federalism was a super boring topic, but what led me to think about it was talking to people who would tell me, like, this is what changed when I moved to X or Y state, or when I moved to a different county, or when I moved across neighborhoods. And so that awareness of the fact that the resources that you have access to are geographically contingent certainly shapes the way that people understand themselves as members of a political community, political and social communities, and the way that they understand the government and the role that the government is or isn't playing. Now, in the book, with respect to Medicaid, I find that can in many ways be a sort of demobilizing politically, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? And in fact, at the kind of grassroots level, a quite savvy approach that I've seen, that I talk about only a little bit in the book, but more in some work that I'm doing now, is that people use these differences and the kind of arbitrariness of them as a tool for organizing and mobilizing people, right? Because it feels, and it is, deeply unjust, and people recognize that why should what I get change when I cross this county line? And so when you alert people to that kind of arbitrariness, that kind of moral wrong, it often can be a basis for organizing and for kind of encouraging them to engage in ways politically that help them to push back against some of these structures that are limiting their ability, say at a local level, to really do good. I'll end with one really quick example in some work that I'm studying now around housing rights in cities across the country. I've been really amazed to see that, like, several housing rights activists in cities like Atlanta have decided that of all the goals that they could pursue, that what they're going to zero in on is organizing to get people to mobilize against preemption, precisely as Professor Rogers mentioned, right? Because they realize we can fight for rent control, we can fight for, better rights in eviction court, and it can all be taken away through this institution of preemption. And so first, maybe we should focus our political energies on undermining that. And that's one way, when you get people to recognize some of the injustices built into the system that create these disparities, you can also get them to organize against them.
That is really fascinating to think about different conceptions of citizenship actually being a mobilizing force. Professor Cohen, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, I'm totally on board with the optimistic view. I think in a sense, like, states have reputations, and like we know some pretty broad brushstroke things about states when it comes to things like taxes, and for a while, healthcare, right? And one of the things that it brings up two things in my mind. First of all, that we would hope that information is shared about kind of what's going on and what's working really well in different states, and even below the state level, but also that can be used to push the federal government too, right? Like, so healthcare is something that we saw innovated at the state level, and then ultimately that was also used to push for more expansion of social rights at the federal level, and with some success. I'd also like to just draw attention to one thing in particular, and that is, like, states have different levels of not just like different rights bundles, but also different ways of approaching administrative burden and like how hard it is to access rights. And we haven't really talked about it very much, but I think states that begin to do things like make it easier to vote, to register to vote, to get things to which you're entitled, are going to also raise the bar for everyone in terms of, like, it should not actually be impossible to apply for basic benefits to which you're entitled.
This conversation is like getting more and more exciting. So I wanted to turn it over to Allan to just respond to this conversation we're having. 2 minutes, because we also have just a couple more things we need to get on the table here.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really important point that the experience, or how we conceptualize who is a citizen, I think we're all kind of saying it definitely depends on where you live in the US, and which state, which city. And for our book, we essentially place the states in terms of policies that they're passing on a continuum scale. So states are granting a certain amount of rights. Some states are granting more robust rights than others. And so it's not a different model per se, but it's the experience of those rights. If you're in a state like California, which we argue has accomplished full citizenship across the 5 dimensions, whereas other states have not. In fact, the immigrants who are living there, the non-citizens, non-federal citizens who are living there, are going to be more willing to access healthcare or driver's licenses, are going to feel safer in areas that are not being that are more sanctuary oriented. And so there's a range of things that will shape their experience as non-citizens who are being targeted by the federal government in terms of enforcement. So it will vary for sure.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who are adding questions to the question queue, we really appreciate it. The panelists can see those, and so are trying to answer them. We are about to run out of time, but I wanted to give Professor Rogers a chance to just add some thoughts to the ongoing conversation here.
Well, one thing I've been meaning to say, waiting for Jamila to say it on Medicare stuff, is if you want to get a perfect example of how a progressive or democratic federalism could actually work, just go to Oregon and look at the community care organizations. That's where you had an indigenous movement in the state, reasonably progressive reformers working with the federal government to make a minor change in a Medicaid funding formula. And the net result was, through a lot of local agitation, a lot of community meetings, I mean, a ton of meetings, agreement on a system which is now providing superior care with at a vastly lower than national increase in annual costs. They've actually bent the cost curve, the famous cost curve, to 1.5 million people. And the superior care, you actually see it in the results of Oregonians. That was the spirit in which I was suggesting, let's get some money out to people who are actually doing stuff locally. So what more do I have to say? I don't know. Be brave, be strong. Ego is the problem and love is the answer. I don't know what to add.
All right, on that note, we're going to wrap up the panel comments, and I want to thank the panelists for the really astute conversation and observations, and I'll turn it over to Karthick Ramakrishnan, who has some follow-ups here.
Thank you, Janelle. And I just want to recognize there are a couple of other comments that came, and one of them I want to recognize. It asks about conservative jurisprudence, and in many ways, with a conservative court, we can potentially see this as a way. We saw this even in terms of some of the lawsuits that were brought up, in the course of this election, right? General deference to state legislatures. And the question is, should we expect to see more of that? I think we will see, right? I mean, this will be kind of a good test of if you start to see jurisdictions, like Oregon, like California, New York State. I mean, depending on the policies, there are different states that are trying to push the envelope and really build upon what Congress has provided. Will the conservative Supreme Court give the same kind of leeway as they have on some of the kind of removal of rights, say on reproductive rights, which they've given? So I think time will tell. You would hope that folks are principled when it comes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's not just naked partisanship and kind of beating back what they see as an inevitable tide in terms of some of these policies that are expanding rights. But I think it's something that we have to watch out for. And also beyond that, it's something that we have to continue to fight for. We just cannot take it for granted that the courts in a kind of quote unquote state rights kind of framework will be, as accommodating. One thing I will say though is on immigrant rights in the past, many of California's policies have withstood court challenges in circuit courts and district and courts of appeals. So that does give me some hope. Just looking ahead, I just want to say a couple of things. This notion of state citizenship, a lot of folks want to go beyond what we talk about in the book, and I think that's important. We ground citizenship in rights, and a lot of people are interested in talking about what it means to be a Californian in terms of what are the kinds of obligations, right? And not just in terms of the obligations of government, but even the obligations of philanthropy, for example. There are folks who are starting to talk about an Angelino citizenship, right? And what that means. What does it mean for businesses, for philanthropy, for government to have the strong notion of obligation to their resident population? I think there's a lot of interesting things there. Also in terms of identities, right? Texas, there's a very, very strong identity, what it means to be Texan. Will we see progressive states like Californians, Oregonians, et cetera, have a similar kind of robust sense of citizenship that goes beyond rights, even beyond obligations, to identity? Final thing I'll just say, this is the first installment in what we hope to be a regular conversation. And we know that there are others, scholars as well as practitioners, that want to keep making sure that we're advancing the ball when it comes to rights expansion in whatever realm. Beyond rights, there are also those working on progressive federalism from an environmental sustainability point of view that are very interested and eager to make sure that we continue moving the ball forward. So that's something that our center has volunteered on a quarterly basis to continue these kinds of forums. And I know, Joel, that you and I have talked about cows and the role that it's already played. So I don't know, but in the 2 or 3 minutes we have left, I would love to hear from the other panelists in terms of what some of your continuing interests might be to make sure both on scholarship, but also in practice, that we continue this rights expansion work.
You mean topic areas, or you mean conceptual arguments?
Either topic areas, or even even some of the practitioner work. All of us here, I think, are connected. We're not just scholars. We're connected to practitioners in different ways, right?
Housing, transportation, energy, communication, others, and transportation, mobility.
Thank you.
Are all things that are almost totally decided at the local or state level, and all are completely screwed up in America, and you can improve them all vastly through some local action if you're allowed to take that action. So I'd love to talk about and then public safety, of course.
Yeah, I love the idea of a conversation, that's structured similarly to this, but with different folks in the room, including, organizers on the local level and on the state level, and sort of thinking across those levels and across those spheres, both academics and folks doing other kinds of work, thinking together about how to sort of both conceptualize things like citizenship and bridge some of these political challenges that we've been talking about for the last hour or so.
I mean,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I think it would also be good to include people who are really expert in the politics of regressive states, right? Because I think that both from organizers, we want to hear from organizers about the challenges they face and what actually works, and then also kind of at a meta level, like what's going on in states where people make choices that are self-defeating for reasons that have nothing to do with their material interests, because that's part of our story too.
Yeah, I think just adding kind of bringing folks who are practitioners and also scholars who can talk about learning across issues or across kind of group-based issues. So immigrant rights speaking to other groups. And there's also probably room to, in the future, bring in non-US focused scholarship. So Europe, Canada, kind of building up this kind of space. Great.
Well, thank you, everyone. And Janelle, just a huge thanks to you for serving as a moderator here. And I'll also say, just admiring Janelle's work, not only in her scholarship, but Janelle does her advocacy and engagement at the federal level. So she's in Maryland, very close to DC, but has gotten involved in rights-based and rights expansion work in the state of Maryland, in the state of California, especially when it comes to racial justice issues. So really appreciate you, Janelle, and the work you do both as a scholar and as a practitioner. And so that does it all for us, folks. And thank you all for joining us. And see you at the next installment in a few months. Let's see how the Biden team gets assembled. Let's see what happens in the Senate. Joel, let's hopefully we will see some progressive movement there. But regardless, I think it's clear that this conversation is just the beginning, and there's so much more yet to be done. Thank you.
Well, and it was real important even in the last day that Murkowski and Collins and Sass and Romney all said they recognized Biden as the president. That means you got the votes in the Senate to accept a reasonable electoral college decision. That was a really critical thing. Well before and I'm hoping for it, the Peachtree or Peach State miracle, but well before then, I think we're okay, actually. Of course, they could be like Lindsey Graham and just say, well, that's what I said yesterday, and now I'm changing my mind. But I don't think even someone like Sass is like Lindsey Graham. There are very few people in the world who are quite like Lindsey in terms of their duplicity and mirabondness. Okay, I'll stop. Sorry.
Okay, well, let me end the broadcast. Thank you, everyone. We can just stay on, folks. Let's just stay on for a little bit here. Thank you, everyone.